Sometimes love finds you when you've stopped looking for it entirely. At 53, Queen Maebelle had given up on the idea that any man could see past her wealth to find her heart. In the Colorado territories, every wealthy rancher and land baron came calling with fancy clothes and smooth talk. She tested them all for courage, kindness, and truth. Every single one failed. Her heart stayed locked away behind years of disappointment. Then one morning, a mountain man appeared at her gates. He had weathered hands, frost in his beard, and a wolf by his side. He didn't bow or make promises. He just looked her in the eye like no man ever had. But what made this wild stranger different from all the others? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Thornfield estate, painting the Colorado mountains in shades of gold and amber that reminded Maebelle of better days. She stood at her study window, coffee growing cold in her hands, watching the hands tend to the horses in the distant pasture. At 53, she had learned to find comfort in routine, in the predictable rhythm of ranch life that had sustained her through 23 years of widowhood. Her reflection in the glass showed a woman who had aged with grace, but not without cost. Silver streaked through hair that had once been the color of autumn leaves, and lines mapped the terrain of her face like rivers carved by time and sorrow. Yet her eyes remained sharp, the pale blue of winter sky, missing nothing that happened on her land. The leather-bound ledger on her mahogany desk told the story of her empire in neat columns of figures. Thornfield Estate sprawled across 15,000 acres of Colorado territory, from the high meadows where her cattle grazed to the silver mine that had made her fortune. Every entry in that ledger bore her careful handwriting, a testament to the mind that had transformed her late husband's modest ranch into one of the most prosperous operations west of the Mississippi. Morning, Miss Maebelle. Martha's voice carried the warmth of 20 years of friendship disguised as employment. The housekeeper entered with fresh coffee and the knowing look of a woman who had watched her mistress struggle with loneliness for far too long. Good morning, Martha. Maebelle accepted the cup gratefully, inhaling the rich aroma that never failed to remind her of the life she had built from ashes. Sam's already got the men working the south pasture. Been out there since dawn, just like every day for the past 15 years. Martha's tone carried gentle reproach. At 60, the housekeeper had earned the right to speak plainly. That man works harder than men half his age, and you know it's because he's trying to fill the hole your husband's death left in this place. Maebelle nodded, understanding the unspoken message. Sam Rodriguez had been Thomas's best friend, the foreman who had stood by her side through every crisis, every decision, every lonely year since the fever took her husband. His loyalty was absolute, his dedication unwavering, and his concern for her solitary state increasingly obvious. The morning ritual continued as it had for years. Martha bustled about the study, straightening papers that needed no straightening, dusting furniture that bore no dust, all while stealing glances at her mistress with the practiced eye of someone who knew when to speak and when to remain silent. "Will you be receiving visitors today?" Martha asked, though they both knew the answer. Tuesday meant the weekly parade of suitors, each arriving with letters of introduction, gifts of flowers, and transparent intentions toward her fortune. "Mr. Harrison Caldwell is expected at 2, Maebelle replied, settling behind her desk with resigned efficiency. The banker from Denver comes with excellent references and a portfolio that would impress most women. But not you, but not me." Maebelle opened the ledger, her fingers tracing the familiar pages. "They see the estate, Martha. They see the silver mine and the cattle and the bank accounts. Not one of them sees the woman who built this from nothing but determination and her husband's good name." The truth of her situation lay heavier on her shoulders with each passing year. Thomas Thornfield had left her a small ranch and a modest inheritance. What she had built since his death was her own creation, born from late nights studying market reports, early mornings riding fence lines, and the kind of calculated risks that would have horrified the society ladies who whispered about her unladylike behavior. Her tests had become legendary throughout the territory. Every suitor faced 3 challenges, though none knew they were being evaluated. Courage. Would they stand their ground when faced with danger, or retreat behind the safety of hired men? Kindness. How did they treat the servants, the ranch hands, the people they considered beneath their notice? Truth. When pressed about their intentions, would they speak honestly or continue the elaborate charade of courtship that fooled no one? 27 men had failed those tests over the years. 27 polished gentlemen who had ridden away from Thornfield Estate with wounded pride and empty hands. The memory of her daughter's death still lived in this room, in the small Bible on the side table, where a pressed wildflower marked Sarah's favorite verse. 10 years old when the fever took her, bright as starlight and twice as precious. The child had been her anchor to hope, her reason to believe that love could bloom again in the rocky soil of her heart. After Sarah's death, the tests had become more stringent, the requirements impossibly high. Perhaps she was protecting herself from further loss, or perhaps she simply knew that no man could measure up to the memory of the husband who had loved her truly, and the daughter who had been their living proof that miracles existed. "You know," Martha said carefully, arranging fresh flowers in the crystal vase by the window, "there's more to life than running an empire, is there?" Maebelle's voice carried no bitterness, only the weight of years spent learning that security came from strength, not from depending on others. "I've built something that will last, Martha. Something that means the people who work here will always have a place, always have enough." "That's not nothing. No, it's not nothing. But it's not everything either." The conversation ended, as it always did, with understanding but no resolution. Martha had buried 2 husbands of her own, knew the particular ache of sleeping alone in a bed meant for 2. But she also knew that her mistress had armored her heart so thoroughly that even she couldn't find the key to unlock it. The morning passed in familiar patterns. Correspondence from buyers interested in her cattle, reports from the mine supervisor about new veins of silver discovered in the eastern tunnels, invoices from suppliers who had learned to respect both her business acumen and her unforgiving attention to detail. Each document received her careful consideration, each decision made with the deliberate precision that had built her reputation throughout the territory. At noon, Sam knocked on the study door with his weekly report. His weathered face showed the effects of decades spent working under the Colorado sun, but his dark eyes remained sharp with intelligence and unwavering loyalty. "The new mares are settling in well," he reported, hat in hand, despite Maebelle's repeated requests that he remain covered in her presence. "That stallion from Kentucky is proving his worth. Should have some fine foals come spring. And the men? Any concerns I should know about?" "They're good men, Miss Maebelle. Work hard, keep their troubles to themselves. Though I will say there's been some talk in town about your—" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Your standards when it comes to suitors." Maebelle's laugh held no humor. "Let them talk, Sam. I've spent 23 years proving that a woman can run an empire without a man's help. I'm not about to compromise now for the sake of gossip. No, ma'am, I wouldn't expect you to. Just thought you should know that some folks think you're being too particular. Some folks have never had to rebuild their entire world from nothing." Her voice softened as she studied the man who had been her most trusted ally. "You've never questioned my decisions, Sam. Why is that?" "Because I was there when Mr. Thomas died. Saw how you could have sold everything, moved back east, lived comfortable on what he left you. Instead, you rolled up your sleeves and got to work. Takes a special kind of person to turn grief into something productive instead of letting it consume them." The weight of his words settled between them. Acknowledgement of the strength that had cost her so much to maintain. After Sam left to return to his duties, Maebelle found herself drawn once again to the window, watching the endless dance of ranch life that continued regardless of her personal struggles. 2 o'clock approached with the inevitability of seasons changing. Harrison Caldwell would arrive precisely on time, as successful men always did. He would bring flowers, speak of business ventures and shared interests, perhaps mention his own substantial holdings in Denver banking. He would be courteous, intelligent, appropriately deferential to her position, while making it clear that he considered himself her equal in all things that mattered. And he would fail her tests, just as all the others had failed. The certainty of it should have brought resignation, but instead, Maebelle felt only a hollow sadness for the young woman she had once been, the one who had believed that love was not only possible, but inevitable. That woman had died with her husband and daughter, leaving behind this careful, controlled version who measured every risk and found them all wanting. The grandfather clock in the corner chimed too, its deep bronze voice echoing through the study like a bell tolling the end of hope. Soon she would hear the sound of approaching hooves, would watch another man ride up to her door with confidence in his eyes and calculation in his heart. But for now, in the quiet moments before the performance began again, Maebelle allowed herself to remember what it felt like to be loved truly, completely, without condition or agenda. The memory was precious, precisely because she knew it would never come again. Outside, the Colorado mountains stood eternal against the autumn sky, their peaks crowned with early snow that caught the afternoon light like promises made and broken. Somewhere in those mountains, she thought, there might be men who understood that a woman's worth wasn't measured in acres or silver, but in the depths of her heart and the strength of her character. But those men, if they existed at all, would never find their way to her door. The storm arrived without warning, as October storms often did in the Colorado high country. One moment the afternoon sky showed clear blue stretching toward the mountains, and the next, dark clouds boiled over the peaks like smoke from some celestial fire. Maebelle had lived here long enough to read the signs, the sudden stillness in the air, the way the horses lifted their heads and turned toward the west, the particular quality of light that meant snow would follow rain. She was reviewing the quarterly mining reports when the first drop struck her study window. By the time she looked up from the ledgers, the storm had transformed from a distant threat into an immediate reality. Rain lashed against the glass with increasing fury, and the wind howled around the corners of the house like some wild thing seeking shelter. "Martha," she called, rising from her desk as lightning split the sky. "We'll need to—" The sound of hoofbeats cut through the storm's roar, growing louder as they approached the main house. Maebelle moved to the window, pressing her face against the cold glass to peer through the driving rain. Through the grey curtain of water, she could make out a solitary rider approaching the circular drive, moving with the steady purpose of someone who knew where he was going, despite the chaos around him. The man sat his horse with an ease that spoke of years in the saddle, seemingly unbothered by the storm that would have sent most travelers seeking immediate shelter. As he drew closer, Maebelle could see that he wore no hat, allowing the rain to stream down his face and into his beard. A wolf trotted alongside his horse, grey as the storm itself, keeping pace with casual grace that suggested a bond deeper than mere companionship. Who in their right mind travels in this weather? Martha appeared at her shoulder, squinting through the rain-streaked glass. "Someone who either has urgent business or nowhere else to go," Maebelle replied, though something about the rider's unhurried approach suggested the latter rather than the former. The man reined in his horse at the foot of the front steps, taking his time to survey the house and outbuildings with the methodical attention of someone accustomed to evaluating his surroundings. He dismounted with fluid motion, water cascading from his heavy coat, and stood for a moment stroking his horse's neck in what seemed like a gesture of reassurance. The wolf sat beside him, yellow eyes scanning the area with alert intelligence. When the man moved toward the front door, the animal followed, close enough to touch but never crowding, maintaining the perfect distance of a partner rather than a pet. Maebelle found herself moving toward the front door before Martha's knock announced the visitor's arrival. Something about the man's presence pulled at her, perhaps the way he moved with quiet confidence, or the manner in which he had approached her home without the swagger she had come to expect from men seeking her attention. She opened the door herself, surprising Martha, who had already started toward the entrance. The man on her doorstep stood well over 6 feet, with broad shoulders that spoke of physical labor and hands that bore the calluses of honest work. His hair, dark with streaks of silver, hung wet against his collar, and his beard carried the frost of early winter mornings. But it was his eyes that held her, green as deep forest shadows, steady and direct in a way that made her feel as though he was seeing something in her that others missed. "Ma'am," he said, his voice carrying the rough gentleness of someone more comfortable with silence than words. "Name's Jeremiah Stone. I'm caught in this storm and was hoping you might allow my horse shelter in your barn. I can pay for the privilege." The wolf beside him remained motionless, watching Maebelle with those unsettling yellow eyes that seemed to look straight through to her soul. There was no aggression in the animal's stance, only the alert attention of a creature that understood the importance of this moment without knowing why. "Mr. Stone," Maebelle heard herself say, though part of her mind was still cataloguing the details of his appearance, the careful way he held himself, the respect in his voice that felt genuine rather than calculated, the absence of the smooth deference she had grown to despise. "This storm will likely last the night. Your horse is welcome in the barn, and you're welcome to shelter there as well." Something flickered in those green eyes, surprise perhaps, or gratitude. "That's generous of you, ma'am." "I'm much obliged." He touched his forehead where the brim of a hat would have been, a gesture that managed to convey respect without subservience. As he turned to lead his horse toward the barn, Maebelle found herself calling after him, "Mr. Stone." He paused, looking back through the driving rain. "There's hot coffee and warm food in the kitchen, if you've a mind for it once you've seen to your horse." "Thank you kindly, ma'am." "I appreciate the hospitality." Maebelle closed the door and stood with her back against it, aware that Martha was watching her with undisguised curiosity. The encounter had lasted perhaps 3 minutes, yet something fundamental had shifted in the carefully ordered world of her expectations. "Interesting man," Martha observed, moving toward the kitchen with the purposeful stride of someone who had already decided to prepare enough food for 3. "He has a wolf," Maebelle said, as though that explained the sudden flutter in her chest. "Lot of mountain men keep wolves. Helps with hunting, protection, though that one looked more like a partner than a pet." The storm continued its assault on the house, but now Maebelle found herself listening for sounds from the barn, the whinny of horses settling for the night, the creak of wooden stalls, perhaps the murmur of a man's voice, speaking to his animals with the affection of someone who spent more time with beasts than with people. An hour passed before she heard the knock on the kitchen door. Martha answered it, returning with a man who looked somehow smaller in the warm light of the kitchen, though no less compelling. He had removed his heavy coat, revealing a simple wool shirt that emphasized the breadth of his shoulders and the lean strength of his frame. His hair, now dry, showed more silver than she had initially noticed, and his face bore the lines of someone who had spent years squinting into sun and wind. "Mrs. he began, then paused as he realized he didn't know her name. "Thornfield," she supplied. "Maebelle Thornfield. And this is Martha, who keeps this household running far better than I ever could. Ma'am, Miss Martha." He nodded to each in turn, his manners carrying the unconscious courtesy of a man raised to respect women regardless of their station. "I'm grateful for the shelter. Storm caught me about 10 miles out, and my horse was starting to struggle." Martha placed a steaming plate before him, beef stew with fresh bread, the kind of hearty meal that had sustained cowboys and mountain men for generations. Jeremiah Stone ate with the deliberate attention of someone who never took a good meal for granted, pausing between bites to answer Maebelle's careful questions about his travels. "Been up in the high country since spring," he said, breaking bread with hands that were scarred but clean. "Trapping mostly, though there's not much market for pelts anymore. Mostly I keep to myself and let the world get along without me." "Lonely life," Maebelle observed, watching the way he handled his fork with the same economical grace he had shown in mounting and dismounting his horse. "Some would say so. I find there's peace in it. No expectations, no disappointments. Just the mountains and the seasons and whatever each day brings. The words carried a weight that suggested experience with both expectations and disappointments, though he offered no details. Outside, the storm continued its work, but inside the kitchen, warmth and lamplight created a haven that felt separate from the world's troubles. When the wolf appeared at the kitchen door, yellow eyes gleaming in the darkness, Jeremiah rose immediately. "That's Ghost," he said simply. "He'll want his dinner. Ghost. Found him as a pup, alone and half-starved. Figured we were both ghosts of sorts, better off haunting the mountains than trying to live among regular folks." He moved toward the door, but Maebelle found herself speaking before she had consciously decided to do so. "Bring him inside. A storm like this is no weather for any creature to be wandering." Jeremiah paused, his hand on the door latch. "Ma'am, Ghost isn't exactly what you'd call a house pet. He's wild, even after all these years with me. So are you, I suspect. But that doesn't mean either of you has to freeze while there's warmth to be shared." Something in his expression shifted then, a recognition that this woman understood something about the nature of wild things and the value of unexpected kindness. He opened the door, and Ghost padded into the kitchen with the silent grace of a creature comfortable in any environment, but belonging fully to none. The wolf was larger than Maebelle had expected, with intelligent yellow eyes that seemed to catalogue every detail of his surroundings before settling into a watchful calm beside Jeremiah's chair. When Martha placed a bowl of table scraps on the floor, Ghost looked to his human companion for permission before approaching the food, a gesture that spoke of discipline and trust in equal measure. "He's beautiful," Maebelle said, meaning it. There was something magnificent about the animal's wildness, the way he maintained his essential nature while adapting to unexpected circumstances. That he is. Saved my life more than once up in the mountains. Bears, mostly, though there was one time with claim jumpers who thought they could take what wasn't theirs. The storm raged on outside, but inside the kitchen, 3 people and 1 wolf settled into the kind of companionable quiet that sometimes springs up between strangers when circumstances strip away the usual social barriers. Maebelle found herself studying Jeremiah Stone with growing curiosity, noting the way he listened more than he spoke, the careful economy of his movements, the manner in which his presence seemed to fill the room without dominating it. For the first time in years, she found herself looking forward to morning, not because it would bring the end of an unwelcome visit, but because it might bring the opportunity to learn more about this quiet man who traveled with a wolf and spoke of the mountains as other men spoke of home. Dawn broke, clear and sharp over the Colorado mountains. The storm's fury spent in the night like a fever finally broken. Maebelle woke earlier than usual, drawn from sleep by the unusual quiet that follows a night of wind and rain. Sunlight streamed through her bedroom windows, painting everything in shades of gold that made the world look newly made. She dressed with more care than she had in recent memory, choosing a simple blue dress that brought out the color of her eyes while maintaining the practical elegance that had become her signature. As she pinned her silver-streaked hair into its customary arrangement, she caught herself wondering whether Jeremiah Stone was an early riser, or if the storm had granted him the deep sleep of exhaustion. The kitchen was already warm when she arrived, Martha having risen before dawn, as was her habit. Coffee steamed in the pot, and the scent of baking bread filled the air with homely comfort. "Our guest stirring yet?" Maebelle asked, accepting the cup Martha pressed into her hands. "Been up for an hour, tending to his horse and that wolf of his. Saw him through the window, checking the barn for storm damage." Martha's voice carried approval. "Man who sees to his animals before himself is worth something in this world." Through the kitchen window, Maebelle could see Jeremiah moving with purposeful economy around the barn, Ghost at his side like a grey shadow. Even at this distance, there was something compelling about the way he moved. No wasted motion, each gesture serving a clear purpose. He had the unconscious grace of someone who had spent years adapting to his environment rather than trying to bend it to his will. "I should offer him breakfast before he continues on his way," she said, though part of her hoped he might not be eager to leave so soon, already planned on it. "Can't send a man back into the mountains on an empty stomach, especially with winter coming on." Martha paused in her work, giving Maebelle a look that held 20 years of friendship and understanding. Course, he might not be in such a hurry to leave if he had reason to stay. Before Maebelle could respond to that loaded observation, the kitchen door opened and Jeremiah appeared, removing his hat with the same unconscious courtesy he had shown the night before. His hair was damp from washing at the pump, and his clothes, while simple, were clean and well-maintained. "Morning, ma'am. Miss Martha." He nodded to each in turn, his green eyes bright with the alertness of someone accustomed to greeting each day as a gift rather than an obligation. "I wanted to thank you both for the hospitality. Storm would have been rough on Ghost and the horse without your barn to shelter in." "Think nothing of it," Maebelle replied, gesturing toward the table where Martha was already setting a place for him. "The least we could do on a night like that." "I hope you slept well." "Better than I have in months," he admitted, taking the offered seat with visible appreciation. "Been a while since I spent a night with a roof over my head and walls to keep the wind out." Martha placed a plate before him. Eggs fresh from the henhouse, bacon, and bread still warm from the oven. Jeremiah looked at the generous portion with something approaching wonder, as though he couldn't quite believe such abundance was meant for him. "This is more than kind," he said, but made no move to begin eating until Ghost appeared at the kitchen door. The wolf padded inside with the same silent grace he had shown the night before. Settling beside Jeremiah's chair with patient attention, Maebelle watched fascinated as Jeremiah broke off a piece of bacon and held it out to Ghost. The wolf waited, yellow eyes fixed on his companion's face, until Jeremiah gave an almost imperceptible nod. Only then did Ghost accept the offered food, taking it with delicate care, despite teeth that could easily have removed fingers. "He won't eat until you give permission?" she asked. Old habit from when he was a pup. Food was scarce in those days, and I needed him to understand that survival sometimes meant waiting. Jeremiah's voice carried the weight of memories he didn't elaborate on. "Turned out to be useful when we encountered other folks. People are more comfortable around a wolf that shows discipline." The simple statement revealed layers of consideration and wisdom that intrigued Maebelle. Here was a man who understood that perception mattered, who had taken the time to train his unusual companion, not just for convenience, but for the comfort of others. It spoke to a depth of character that went far beyond the surface impression of a simple mountain man. "You've been in the mountains long?" she asked, settling across from him with her own coffee. 5 years, give or take. "Left civilization after." He paused, his eyes growing distant. "After I lost my family. Figured the mountains might have use for a man who didn't much care about finding his way back to the world." The simple words carried such weight of grief that Maebelle felt her breath catch. She recognized the particular quality of loss he carried, the way it shaped a person's relationship with hope and the future. It was familiar because she carried her own version of the same burden. "I'm sorry for your loss," she said simply, knowing that some sorrows could only be acknowledged, never diminished by well-meaning words. Jeremiah nodded, accepting her condolences with the grace of someone who had learned to carry his pain without burdening others. "Thank you. It was a long time ago, but some things leave marks that don't fade." They ate in comfortable silence for a few minutes. The kind of quiet that springs up between people who understand that not everything needs to be filled with conversation. Outside, the world sparkled with the particular clarity that follows a storm, as though the rain had washed away more than just dust and grime. "I don't suppose," Maebelle heard herself saying, "you'd consider staying on for a few days? We could use an extra hand with the horses, especially someone with your evident skill. The storm may have done some damage to the fence lines that needs checking." Jeremiah paused, with his fork halfway to his mouth, those green eyes studying her with an intensity that made her feel suddenly self-conscious. "That's generous of you, ma'am, but I wouldn't want to impose further on your hospitality." It wouldn't be imposition if you were working for it. Room and board plus fair wages for fair work. Sam, that's my foreman, is getting on in years, and he could use help with the more demanding tasks. She could see him weighing the offer. Practical considerations, warring with what might have been caution about staying too long in one place. Ghost seemed to sense his companion's uncertainty, raising his head to fix those unsettling yellow eyes on Jeremiah's face, as though offering counsel only he could understand. "Winter's coming on," Martha observed, refilling both their coffee cups with the matter-of-fact tone of someone stating an obvious truth. "Might be the mountains get a bit lonely when the snow starts flying in earnest." "They do at that," Jeremiah admitted, a ghost of a smile touching the corners of his mouth. "Though I've grown accustomed to solitude over the years. Sometimes what we grow accustomed to and what's good for us are two different things entirely," Maebelle said, surprising herself with the directness of the observation. Jeremiah's eyes met hers across the table, and for a moment she felt as though they were having a conversation that went far deeper than the simple question of temporary employment. There was something in his gaze that suggested he was seeing past the careful walls she had built around herself, recognizing a kindred spirit in the armor of self-sufficiency. "A few days, then," he said finally, "until you're satisfied the storm didn't cause damage you can't handle with your regular crew." Maebelle felt a flutter of something she had almost forgotten, anticipation, mixed with the particular pleasure that comes from winning a small victory. "Excellent. Sam will be glad of the help, and I confess I'm curious to see how Ghost gets along with our horses. He'll be no trouble. Knows the difference between livestock and prey, and he's got sense enough not to spook animals that aren't his to manage." As if summoned by his name, Ghost rose from his position beside the chair and moved to the kitchen door, yellow eyes fixed on something beyond the glass. A moment later, the sound of approaching hoofbeats announced the arrival of someone else seeking Maebelle's attention. "That'll be Sam," she said, rising to look out the window. "Right on time for the morning report." But even as she spoke, Maebelle found herself hoping that whatever business Sam brought would be brief. For the first time in years, she had something more interesting to occupy her attention than ledgers and reports and the endless details of managing an empire. She had a mystery to solve, in the form of a quiet man who traveled with a wolf and spoke of loss, with the hard-won wisdom of someone who had learned to make peace with grief. Sam Rodriguez appeared at the kitchen door with the punctuality of a man who had structured his life around dependable routines. At 58, he carried himself with the easy confidence of someone who had earned his position through decades of hard work and unwavering loyalty. His weathered face brightened when he saw Jeremiah, though his eyes held the careful assessment of a foreman meeting a new hand. "Sam, I'd like you to meet Jeremiah Stone," Maebelle said, making the introductions with an ease that surprised her. "He'll be helping us for a few days, checking for storm damage and lending a hand with whatever needs doing." "Pleased to meet you," Sam said, extending his hand with the directness that had always been his way. "Any man who can handle himself in weather like last night's is welcome here." Jeremiah rose to take the offered hand, and Maebelle watched with interest as the two men took each other's measure. There was something in Sam's stance that suggested approval, perhaps the calluses on Jeremiah's hands, or the way Ghost sat calmly beside him, or simply the intuition that came from 30 years of judging men by their character rather than their words. "Grateful for the work," Jeremiah replied. "Been a while since I've had the chance to work with horses. Looking forward to it. Well then, let's have a look at what the storm left us." Sam's tone carried the satisfaction of a man who had found an unexpected solution to a problem he hadn't known how to voice. "Got 3 mares ready to foal, and that stallion from Kentucky's been acting up since yesterday. Could use someone with a gentle hand." Maebelle found herself following the 2 men outside, drawn by curiosity and something deeper she wasn't quite ready to name. The morning air was crisp with the promise of autumn's end, and the mountains stood sharp against a sky so blue it hurt to look at directly. In the corral, Jeremiah's expertise became immediately apparent. The Kentucky stallion, a magnificent black animal with fire in his eyes and pride in every line of his body, had been giving the regular hands trouble since his arrival 2 weeks ago. But when Jeremiah approached, moving with the unhurried confidence of someone who understood horses at a fundamental level, the stallion's demeanor shifted from challenge to curiosity. "Easy, boy," Jeremiah murmured, his voice carrying the same gentle authority he had used with Ghost. "Nobody here wants to prove anything to anybody." Maebelle positioned herself at the fence rail, ostensibly watching the interaction between man and horse, but finding her attention divided between Jeremiah's skillful handling of the stallion and the way the morning light caught the silver in his hair. There was something mesmerizing about his patience, the way he allowed the horse to make the first move toward trust rather than demanding submission. "That's quite a touch he has," Sam observed, settling beside her at the fence. "Been 30 years since I've seen a man gentle a horse like that without making it look like work. Where did you learn to handle horses?" Maebelle called out, not bothering to hide her admiration. "Army," Jeremiah replied, without taking his attention from the stallion, who was now allowing himself to be led around the corral with easy compliance. "Cavalry taught me that a partnership works better than domination, especially when your life might depend on your horse trusting you." The simple statement revealed another piece of the puzzle that was Jeremiah Stone. Military service would explain his bearing, the way he moved with unconscious discipline and assessed his surroundings with tactical awareness. It also suggested experiences that might account for the shadows she sometimes glimpsed in those green eyes. The morning passed quickly as Jeremiah threw himself into the work with the focused intensity of someone grateful for meaningful occupation. He checked fence lines damaged by falling branches, repaired a gate latch that had been troubling Sam for weeks, and demonstrated a knowledge of horses that went far beyond simple familiarity. Ghost remained nearby throughout, never interfering but always present, watching the proceedings with those unsettling yellow eyes that seemed to catalogue every detail. The ranch hands, initially wary of the wolf, soon learned to ignore his presence as they would any other working animal. Even the horses seemed to accept Ghost as part of the natural order, though they kept a respectful distance. It was nearly noon when the sound of approaching hooves announced the arrival of Harrison Caldwell, the banker from Denver whose visit Maebelle had dreaded. She watched from her position at the corral as the man dismounted with the careful precision of someone more comfortable in boardrooms than barnyards. Caldwell was everything Jeremiah was not: polished, prosperous, and conscious of his own importance. His clothes spoke of expense and attention to appearance. His manner carried the assurance of a man accustomed to deference, and his eyes held the calculating assessment of someone who saw opportunity in every interaction. "Mrs. Thornfield," he called out, removing his hat with theatrical flourish. "What a pleasure to find you taking an interest in the day-to-day operations. So refreshing to see a woman of business who understands the value of personal oversight." The condescension in his tone made Maebelle's jaw tighten, though she managed to maintain the polite facade that 23 years of business dealings had taught her. "Mr. Caldwell, you're punctual as always. Time is money, as they say." His gaze swept the corral, taking in the scene with the practiced assessment of someone evaluating assets. "Fine animals you have here. The bloodlines alone must represent considerable investment." Maebelle watched Caldwell's eyes linger on the Kentucky stallion, seeing dollar signs rather than the beauty of the animal itself. It was the same look she had learned to recognize in every suitor who had come calling, the calculation that reduced everything, including her, to monetary value. "They serve their purpose," she replied neutrally, aware that Jeremiah had paused in his work to observe the new arrival. Something in the mountain man's posture suggested he was taking Caldwell's measure just as thoroughly as the banker was evaluating the horses. "I've brought the papers we discussed," Caldwell continued. producing a leather portfolio with the satisfaction of someone delivering an expected gift. The investment opportunity I mentioned could prove quite lucrative for someone with your business acumen. Perhaps we should discuss this in the house, Maebelle suggested, though she found herself reluctant to leave the corral where Jeremiah continued his patient work with the horses. Of course. Though I must say, the rustic atmosphere has its charm. Caldwell's tone suggested he found nothing charming about honest work and working men. His gaze flicked dismissively over Jeremiah, cataloguing him as hired help and therefore beneath notice. Ghost, however, seemed to have formed his own opinion of the banker. The wolf's hackles rose slightly as Caldwell passed, and a low growl rumbled deep in his throat, barely audible but unmistakably hostile. "Impressive guard dog," Caldwell observed with nervous laughter. "Though perhaps a bit too wild for civilized company." "He's not a dog," Jeremiah said quietly, his first words to the banker carrying a weight that made Caldwell's smile falter. "And he's an excellent judge of character." The tension that crackled between the two men was almost visible, Caldwell's urbane confidence meeting Jeremiah's quiet authority with results that clearly unsettled the banker. Maebelle found herself studying both men, comparing Caldwell's polished surface to Jeremiah's weathered authenticity. "Well," Caldwell said after a moment of uncomfortable silence, "I suppose we all have our preferences in companions." As they walked toward the house, Maebelle caught herself glancing back at the corral where Jeremiah had returned to his work with the horses. Something about the contrast between the two men had crystallized a truth she had been avoiding. She was tired of polished surfaces and calculated charm. For the first time in years, she found herself drawn to the kind of man who valued substance over appearance, who measured worth in character rather than bank accounts. The realization should have troubled her, given how little she actually knew about Jeremiah Stone. Instead, as she followed Caldwell into the house to discuss investments that suddenly seemed far less important than the mystery of a mountain man who traveled with a wolf and spoke to horses with the voice of someone who understood that trust was earned, not demanded. The autumn social at the Grange Hall had been a tradition in the territory for as long as anyone could remember. Ranchers and townspeople gathered to celebrate the end of harvest season, to share news and gossip, and to maintain the social connections that made frontier life bearable. For Maebelle, these gatherings had become increasingly challenging affairs, elaborate dances around her unmarried status. With every conversation carrying undercurrents about her choice of companions, she stood before her bedroom mirror, adjusting the emerald green dress that brought out her eyes while maintaining the dignity appropriate to her position. The fabric was fine but not ostentatious, the cut elegant without being frivolous. At 53, she had learned to dress for herself rather than to impress others. Though tonight she found herself wondering what Jeremiah might think of her appearance, the thought startled her with its clarity. In the 3 weeks since the storm had brought him to her door, Jeremiah Stone had become a fixture at Thornfield Estate. His temporary employment had extended naturally as his value became apparent. Not just his skill with horses, but his quiet competence with any task that needed doing. More importantly, his presence had begun to feel essential in ways that had nothing to do with ranch work. Martha appeared in the doorway, her expression carrying the satisfaction of someone who had been proven right about something important. "You look lovely, dear, though I suspect your appearance tonight will cause quite a stir because of the dress?" Maebelle asked, though she suspected Martha meant something else entirely, "because of your escort." The whole territory will be talking about Maebelle Thornfield arriving at the social with a mountain man instead of a banker. The decision had crystallized that morning when Caldwell had arrived unannounced, expecting to accompany her to the social as though his presence were a foregone conclusion. His assumption of privilege, combined with his dismissive treatment of Sam when the foreman had tried to discuss a sick mare, had finally exhausted Maebelle's patience with polite pretense. "Mr. Stone is a gentleman," she had told Caldwell firmly, "which is more than can be said for men who assume familiarity that hasn't been invited." Caldwell's face had reddened with wounded pride and something darker. "Mrs. Thornfield, surely you can't be serious about preferring the company of a vagrant over a man of substance and standing?" "I prefer the company of men who judge worth by character, rather than bank accounts," she had replied, her voice carrying the steel that had built her empire. "Mr. Stone has shown more courtesy in 3 weeks than some men manage in a lifetime." Now, as she prepared to make good on that declaration, Maebelle felt a flutter of anticipation that had nothing to do with social obligation and everything to do with the quiet man who had agreed to escort her with a solemnity that suggested he understood the significance of the gesture. Jeremiah waited for her in the front parlor, and when she descended the stairs, the expression in his green eyes made her heart skip in a way it hadn't in decades. He had clearly made an effort. His hair was neatly combed, his beard trimmed, and he wore a dark suit that, while simple, fit him well and emphasized his natural dignity. "You look beautiful, Mom," he said simply, the words carrying such genuine appreciation that Maebelle felt heat rise in her cheeks. "As do you, Mr. Stone, quite distinguished." He offered his arm with the formal courtesy of a man who understood the importance of proper behavior, though there was something in his manner that suggested the gesture cost him effort. Maebelle suspected that crowds and social gatherings were not his natural element, which made his willingness to escort her all the more meaningful. The ride to the Grange Hall passed in comfortable conversation about ranch business and the approaching winter. But underneath the practical topics, Maebelle was aware of a tension that had been building between them for days. There were moments when their hands brushed passing tools, when she caught him watching her with an expression she couldn't quite decipher that suggested their relationship was evolving beyond employer and employee into something neither of them was quite ready to acknowledge. The social was already in full swing when they arrived, the hall filled with the warm light of oil lamps and the sound of fiddle music that spoke of celebration and community. Conversations paused as they entered, not with hostility, but with the frank curiosity that greeted any departure from expected behavior in a small community. Maebelle felt Jeremiah's slight hesitation as they stood in the doorway, surveying the crowd of faces turned in their direction. She placed her hand more firmly on his arm, a gesture of support that she hoped conveyed her confidence in her choice. "Second thoughts," she murmured, though she hoped the answer would be no. "Not about being here with you," he replied quietly, his voice carrying a conviction that made her heart flutter again. "Just been a while since I've been around this many people at once." They made their way into the crowd, accepting greetings and introductions with the dignity that befitted their positions. She as one of the territory's most successful businesswomen, he as her chosen escort whose quiet presence commanded its own form of respect. Maebelle watched with growing admiration as Jeremiah handled the attention with grace, answering questions about his background without elaborating on details that were clearly painful. "Served in the cavalry during the war," he would say when asked about his past, "or been in the mountains since then, mostly keeping to myself." The responses were honest without being revealing, polite without being effusive. The evening's crisis came, predictably, from Harrison Caldwell. The banker had arrived with a widow from Denver, a woman of appropriate age and fortune who clearly hoped to make an impression on the territory's social leaders. But Caldwell's attention remained fixed on Maebelle with an intensity that suggested wounded pride rather than romantic interest. "Mrs. Thornfield," he said, approaching during a break in the music with the determined smile of a man who refused to acknowledge defeat. "How delightful to see you enjoying yourself. Though I must say, your choice of escort has raised some eyebrows." "Has it?" Maebelle's voice carried the dangerous quiet that those who knew her had learned to recognize as a warning. "I can't imagine why. Mr. Stone has shown nothing but perfect courtesy." "Oh, I'm sure he has. It's just that some people are wondering about your, shall we say, your judgment in business matters. A woman's reputation can be so fragile, especially when she's seen to associate with men of questionable background." The threat was delivered with a smile, but it was unmistakably a threat nonetheless. Caldwell's eyes held the calculating gleam of a man who believed he had found leverage to use against her. Before Maebelle could respond, Jeremiah stepped forward with the fluid grace of someone moving to intercept a threat. His voice, when he spoke, carried the quiet authority of a man accustomed to command. "Mr. Caldwell, I believe you've made an error in judgment. Mrs. Thornfield's reputation stands on 23 years of honest business and fair dealing. Any man who suggests otherwise might find himself explaining that position to people who take a different view of the matter." The words were spoken without heat, but there was something in Jeremiah's manner, perhaps the stillness of a man comfortable with conflict, or the way his hand rested casually near the knife at his belt, that made Caldwell's face pale slightly. "I meant no offense," the banker said quickly, his urbane confidence evaporating under Jeremiah's steady gaze. "Simply expressing concern for a lady's welfare." "Then we understand each other," Jeremiah replied, his tone suggesting the conversation was concluded. As Caldwell retreated with his wounded dignity, Maebelle felt a rush of warmth that had nothing to do with the crowded hall. No one had defended her honor in decades, not because she had needed defending, but because she had made it clear she could handle her own battles. But there was something deeply moving about Jeremiah's instinctive protection. The way he had stepped forward without being asked. When the fiddle music resumed and couples began to form for dancing, Jeremiah turned to her with an expression that was part question, part invitation. "Ma'am, I should mention that it's been some time since I've danced. Might be I'm a bit rusty." "Then we'll have to practice," Maebelle replied, accepting his offered hand with a smile that felt as bright as the lamplight surrounding them. As they moved onto the dance floor, Maebelle was acutely aware of the whispered conversations that followed their progress. But for the first time in years, she found she didn't care what others thought. In Jeremiah's arms, moving to music that spoke of celebration and community, she felt like the woman she had been before grief and responsibility had taught her to armor her heart against disappointment. The realization should have frightened her. Instead, as Jeremiah guided her through the steps with surprising grace, she found herself hoping that the song would never end. The first frost came early that year, painting the windows of Thornfield Estate with delicate traceries that caught the morning light like scattered diamonds. Maebelle stood in her study, wrapped in a heavy shawl, watching Jeremiah work with the horses in the corral. His breath misted in the cold air as he moved among the animals, with the patient competence that had become as familiar to her as her own reflection. 3 days had passed since the social, and the territory's gossip mill had been working overtime. Martha reported conversations that ranged from scandalous speculation to grudging admiration, but all centered on the same question: what was Maebelle Thornfield thinking? Choosing a mountain man over more suitable prospects? The answer, Maebelle had come to realize, was that she was thinking clearly for the first time in years. The careful walls she had built around her heart were developing cracks, and through those fissures, she could see possibilities that both thrilled and terrified her. A knock at the study door interrupted her contemplation. "Come in," she called, expecting Martha with the morning correspondence. Instead, Jeremiah appeared, hat in hand, his expression carrying a gravity that made her heart skip with sudden concern. "Ma'am, I need to speak with you about something." "Of course. Please, sit down." She gestured to the chair across from her desk, noting the way he remained standing, as though the conversation required him to be ready for movement. "I've been hearing things in town," he began, his voice carrying the careful neutrality of someone delivering unwelcome news. "Folks talking about your reputation, about the wisdom of associating with someone like me. Yesterday, when I went for supplies, the general store owner made it clear that my presence here is causing complications for you." Maebelle felt anger flash through her, sharp and protective. "What did he say?" "Nothing I haven't heard before. But it got me thinking that maybe my staying here is doing you more harm than good. I've got enough saved to see me through the winter in the mountains. Might be best if I moved on before the snow gets too deep." The words hit her like a physical blow, even though she had been expecting this moment since the social. Jeremiah's pride was as much a part of him as his green eyes or his gentle way with horses, and she had known that the gossip and whispers would eventually drive him to this decision. And if I told you that what people think matters less to me than what I think, she asked, rising from her chair to face him directly. I'd say that's easy words to speak, but harder to live with when it starts affecting your business dealings. Caldwell's been making noise about your judgment, suggesting to other businessmen that maybe you're not as sharp as you used to be. The revelation that Caldwell was actively working against her shouldn't have been surprising, but it still sparked a fury that she struggled to contain. Harrison Caldwell is a small man with wounded pride. His opinion carries no weight with anyone who matters. Maybe not. But rumors have a way of growing, and your empire wasn't built on sentiment. You've worked too hard to let someone like me threaten what you've accomplished. Jeremiah's words were spoken with such quiet conviction that Maebelle realized he truly believed leaving would be best for her. The selflessness of it, his willingness to sacrifice his own happiness for her reputation, only strengthened her resolve to fight for what they had begun to build together. "Walk with me," she said, moving toward the door with the decisiveness that had carried her through 2 decades of business challenges. "There's something I want to show you." They made their way through the house in silence, past rooms filled with furniture and memories that spoke of lives lived and lost. Maebelle led him up the stairs to the 2nd floor, down a hallway she rarely traveled anymore, to a door that had remained closed for years. "This was my daughter's room," she said, turning the brass handle with hands that trembled slightly. "Sarah. She died when she was 10 of fever. I haven't opened this door since Martha and I packed away her things." The room was exactly as they had left it, a shrine to childhood preserved in lavender and cedar. The small bed with its patchwork quilt, the shelf of books and dolls, the rocking chair where Maebelle had spent countless hours reading stories and singing lullabies. But it was the cedar chest at the foot of the bed that drew her attention. She opened it carefully, breathing in the scent of preservation and memory, and withdrew a dress wrapped in tissue paper. The silk was the color of winter sky, with delicate beadwork that caught the light like captured starlight. She had worn it on her wedding day 25 years ago, when the world had seemed full of infinite possibility. "After Thomas died," she said, holding the dress against herself with hands that showed only the slightest tremor, "I put this away and told myself I would never have cause to wear it again. That chapter of my life was closed, finished. I convinced myself that safety lay in solitude, that the only way to avoid loss was to avoid love." Jeremiah watched her with an intensity that seemed to pierce straight through to her soul. "Loss is part of loving," he said quietly. "Can't have one without risking the other. Yes, and for 23 years, I chose to avoid the risk rather than embrace the possibility." She carefully refolded the dress, replacing it in the chest with the reverence due to sacred things. "But you've shown me that there are different kinds of courage. It takes one kind to build an empire. It takes another to open your heart after it's been broken." "Maebelle," he said, and the sound of her name on his lips sent warmth flooding through her chest. It was the first time he had used her given name, abandoning the formal distance that had marked their interactions. "I don't want to be the cause of problems in your life. You're not the cause. You're the solution to a problem I didn't even realize I had." She moved closer to him, close enough to see the silver threading through his hair, the lines that mapped his own journey through loss and healing. "I was dying by degrees, Jeremiah. Successful, respected, and dying inside because I had forgotten what it felt like to be truly alive." The air between them seemed charged with possibility, heavy with words that hadn't yet been spoken, but hung in the space like promises waiting to be claimed. Maebelle could see her own feelings reflected in his eyes, the wonder of unexpected love, the fear of loss that made that love both precious and terrifying. "I have to ask," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "what you lost in the war, was it your wife?" Pain flickered across his features, but he didn't look away. My wife, my son. They died of cholera while I was presumed dead after a cavalry charge. By the time I recovered and made my way home, they'd been in the ground for 6 months. Everything I'd fought to protect was gone. The simple words carried such weight of grief that Maebelle felt tears sting her eyes. I'm sorry. I can't imagine. You don't have to imagine. You know what it's like to lose everything that matters. His hand reached up to touch her face with a gentleness that spoke of hard-won wisdom. Maybe that's why this feels so frightening. We both know how much it can hurt to love someone. Yes, she admitted, leaning into his touch with a surrender that felt like coming home. But we also know how much it hurts to live without love. They stood there in the preserved sanctuary of her daughter's room. Two people who had learned that happiness was not a guarantee, but a choice that had to be made each day. The gossips and the rumors, and the carefully calculated social expectations seemed suddenly insignificant compared to the simple truth of what they felt for each other. When Jeremiah leaned down to kiss her, Maebelle rose to meet him with the courage that had carried her through every challenge she had ever faced. The kiss was gentle, tentative, the first careful step into territory that both of them had thought closed to them forever. When they broke apart, she rested her forehead against his chest, feeling the steady rhythm of his heartbeat beneath her cheek. "Stay," she whispered. "Whatever comes, whatever people say, stay with me, and we'll face it together. Are you certain? Once word gets out that this is more than just employment, let them talk," she said, lifting her head to look directly into his eyes. "I've spent 23 years proving I don't need anyone's approval to live my life. I'm not about to start seeking it now." Outside, the first snow of winter began to fall, dusting the world in white that transformed the familiar landscape into something new and full of promise. The first heavy snow of winter was falling when Harrison Caldwell arrived at Thornfield, estate with the territorial marshal and a leather portfolio. That would change everything. Maebelle watched from her study window as the small party dismounted, noting the grim satisfaction on Caldwell's face and the official bearing of Marshal Davies. A man she had known and respected for 15 years, something cold settled in her stomach. An intuition, born of decades, spent navigating the treacherous waters of business and politics. Men didn't arrive with marshals unless they carried documents that could change lives, and Caldwell's expression suggested he believed he held a winning hand. Martha appeared at her door, face pale with concern. "Miss Maebelle, the marshal's here with that banker fellow. Says he has legal business that can't wait." "Show them to the front parlor," Maebelle replied, smoothing her skirts with hands that showed only the slightest tremor. "And ask Mr. Stone to join us, please." Whatever Caldwell had planned, she suspected it involved Jeremiah. The banker's wounded pride had been festering since the social, and she had learned never to underestimate a small man with access to legal machinery. The parlor felt smaller with 4 people in it, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Marshal Davies removed his hat with the respectful air of a man who genuinely regretted his presence, while Caldwell practically vibrated with anticipation. "Mrs. Thornfield," the marshal began, his weathered face showing the strain of whatever duty had brought him here. "I'm afraid I have some questions that need answering, and some documents that require your attention." "What kind of questions, Marshal?" Caldwell stepped forward before Davies could respond, his portfolio open and papers spread with theatrical precision. "The kind that concern the legal ownership of this estate, and whether certain parties have been operating under false pretenses." Maebelle felt her world tilt slightly, though her expression remained carefully neutral. "I'm afraid I don't understand." "Then perhaps Mr. Stone can enlighten us all." Caldwell's eyes glittered with malicious triumph as he turned toward Jeremiah, who had entered silently and now stood with the stillness of a man preparing for battle. "Or should I say Mr. Thornfield?" The name hit the room like a thunderclap. Maebelle felt the blood drain from her face as she stared at Jeremiah, searching his expression for denial that never came. Instead, she saw something she had never seen before in those steady green eyes. Shame. "That's not possible," she said. though even as the words left her mouth, pieces of a puzzle she hadn't known existed began falling into place. "Thomas never mentioned a brother, didn't he?" Caldwell's voice carried the satisfaction of a cat with a cornered mouse. According to military records, Captain Jeremiah Thornfield was reported missing in action during the Battle of Cedar Creek in 1864, presumed dead after a cavalry charge that went wrong. But here he stands, very much alive, having spent the last 25 years hiding under an assumed name. Marshal Davies cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Ma'am, I verified these documents with the Territorial Courthouse and the War Department. The birth records, the military commission, the family Bible entries, they all confirm that this man is Jeremiah Thornfield, younger brother of your late husband Thomas." Maebelle sank into the nearest chair, her legs suddenly unable to support her weight. The room seemed to spin around her as implications crashed through her mind like an avalanche. If Jeremiah was Thomas's brother, if he had legal claim to the Thornfield name and inheritance, "You knew," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "All this time you knew who you were." "No." Jeremiah's voice carried such pain that it cut through her shock like a blade. "Not at first. I lost my memory after the battle, spent months in a field hospital not knowing my own name. By the time I remembered, I learned that my brother had married a woman named Maebelle, that they were happy together. I chose to stay dead rather than complicate their lives." "How convenient," Caldwell interjected with obvious skepticism. "A lost memory that returned just in time to avoid inconvenient questions." "It's the truth," Jeremiah said quietly, his eyes never leaving Maebelle's face. "I took the name Stone and went west, tried to forget everything about Jeremiah Thornfield. I never intended to come here, never planned to deceive anyone." "But you did deceive," Caldwell pressed, sensing weakness. "You deceived Mrs. Thornfield about your identity, your legal standing, your intentions. And according to territorial law, as the surviving male heir of the Thornfield line, you have legitimate claim to this estate." The words hung in the air like poison, contaminating everything Maebelle thought she understood about her life, her marriage, her feelings for the man she had been learning to love. The estate Thomas had left her, the foundation upon which she had built her empire, if Jeremiah had legal claim to it, then everything she had accomplished might be built on uncertain ground. "Is that what this has been about?" she asked, her voice growing stronger as anger began to burn through the shock. "Some elaborate scheme to reclaim your family inheritance?" "No," Jeremiah said with such vehement conviction that Ghost, who had been lying quietly by the fireplace, raised his head in alert concern. "I swear to you, Maebelle, I never wanted anything from you but what? The chance to seduce a lonely widow into signing over her property. Did you and Mr. Caldwell plan this together?" "What?" Caldwell's face flushed red with indignation. "Mrs. Thornfield, I am the one exposing this deception, not participating in it. This man has clearly been manipulating you, gaining your trust and affection in order to position himself to claim what was never rightfully yours to begin with." Marshal Davies shifted uncomfortably, clearly wishing he was anywhere else. "Ma'am, the legal questions here are complex. If Mr. Thornfield is indeed the surviving heir, there may need to be a review of the estate's ownership status." Maebelle felt the walls of her carefully constructed world crumbling around her. Everything she had built, every choice she had made, suddenly seemed precarious, built on foundations that might not belong to her at all. But underneath the shock and betrayal, something harder was crystallizing, the steel determination that had carried her through every crisis of the past 23 years. "Get out," she said, rising from her chair with the regal bearing that had earned her the title of Queen of the Colorado Territories. "Maebelle." "Please," Jeremiah started forward, but she stopped him with a look that could have frozen fire. "I said, get out. All of you. I need time to think, time to process what I've learned here today." "Mrs. Thornfield," Caldwell said with oily concern, "I understand this must be shocking, but we really should discuss the legal implications. Mr. Caldwell, if you're not off my property in the next 5 minutes, I'll have you removed by force." "Marshal Davies, I assume you've done your duty," in delivering this information. I'll contact the territorial attorney when I'm ready to address the legal questions. The marshal nodded with obvious relief. Yes, ma'am. I'll be available if you need anything clarified. Jeremiah stood frozen in the center of the parlor, his face a mask of anguish that might have moved her under other circumstances. Maebelle, I know how this looks, but I swear on my wife's grave that I never came here with any intention of claiming anything from you. Your wife, she repeated, the words tasting bitter in her mouth. The wife you told me about. Was any of that true, or was it all part of the performance? It was true. Every word. His voice broke slightly, showing cracks in the composed exterior she had grown to trust. Sarah and Matthew died while I was missing. I came back to find their graves, and my brother married to a woman I had never met. I thought the kindest thing was to let Jeremiah Thornfield stay dead. The pain in his voice was real. She could hear that much through her anger and confusion. But pain could be performed, and she had learned long ago that emotions could be weaponized by clever men who understood how to play on a woman's sympathies. I don't know what to believe anymore, she said, the admission costing her more than she wanted to reveal. I thought I knew you, thought I understood what was growing between us. Now I find out that everything I believed was built on lies, not lies. Never lies about my feelings for you, but lies about everything else that matters. Your name, your identity, your legal standing. How am I supposed to trust anything you say now? Jeremiah's shoulders sagged as though the weight of the deception had finally become unbearable. You can't. I understand that. But I want you to know that what I feel for you is the most honest thing in my life. It's the reason I should have told you the truth weeks ago, and the reason I'm telling you now to claim nothing that isn't freely given. What do you mean? I mean I renounce any claim to this estate, legal or otherwise. Whatever rights I might have inherited died with Jeremiah Thornfield in that cavalry charge. The man who loves you is Jeremiah Stone, and he wants nothing from you but what you choose to give. The declaration should have been reassuring, but instead it only added another layer of complexity to an already impossible situation. If he was lying about his intentions, the renunciation was meaningless. If he was telling the truth, then she was condemning a man for the crime of loving her under an assumed name. I need you to leave, she said finally, the words cutting her throat like broken glass. I need time to sort through this, to understand what's real and what's performance. I can't do that with you here. Jeremiah nodded slowly, accepting her decision with the same quiet dignity he had shown throughout their relationship. I'll be in the mountains if you decide you want to hear the whole truth. Ghost knows the way back. As the three men filed out of her parlor, leaving her alone with the wreckage of her carefully ordered world, Maebelle sank back into her chair and allowed herself to feel the full weight of what she had lost. Not just a man she had been learning to love, but the certainty about her own life that had sustained her through decades of solitary struggle. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering the familiar landscape in white that made everything look different, uncertain, transformed into something she no longer recognized. The snow fell for 3 days straight, blanketing Thornfield Estate in a silence that matched the hollow quiet in Maebelle's heart. She spent those days in her study, surrounded by legal documents and correspondence that painted an increasingly complex picture of her situation. The territorial attorney had been frank in his assessment. Jeremiah's claim, if pressed, would be nearly impossible to contest in court. Martha brought meals that went largely untouched, and reports from Sam about ranch operations that required decisions Maebelle felt unprepared to make. The careful order that had sustained her for 23 years seemed to have crumbled along with her trust. Leaving her adrift in uncertainty, she had sworn never to feel again. You need to eat something, Martha said on the 4th morning, setting down a tray with obvious determination. And you need to make some decisions about what comes next. What decisions are there to make? Maebelle asked, not looking up from the legal brief that had occupied her attention for the past hour. If Jeremiah chooses to press his claim, I could lose everything. If he doesn't, I'll spend the rest of my life wondering when he might change his mind. And if you're making yourself sick over a man who might be telling the truth about loving you more than any inheritance? The question hung in the air between them, heavy with implications Maebelle wasn't ready to consider. She had spent the past 3 days cataloguing every interaction with Jeremiah, searching for signs of deception she might have missed. The evidence was frustratingly mixed. Moments of genuine emotion, alongside the undeniable fact that he had concealed his identity for months. A knock at the study door interrupted her brooding. "Come in," she called, expecting Sam with another question about winter preparations. Instead, the door opened to reveal a man she hadn't seen in over a year, Judge William Hayes, the territorial justice who had presided over many of the legal challenges that had tested her business empire. His presence could only mean that word of her situation had reached official channels. "William," she said, rising to greet him with the courtesy due to an old friend and respected colleague. "This is unexpected, Maebelle." He removed his hat, his weathered face showing the gravity that brought him to her door. "I came as soon as I heard about the complications surrounding your estate. This is a delicate matter that requires careful handling. Delicate is one word for it." She gestured him to a chair, noting the way his eyes took in the scattered documents and her own obvious exhaustion. "I assume you've reviewed the legal questions involved?" "I have, and I've also made some inquiries into Mr. Caldwell's role in bringing these matters to light." Judge Hayes settled into his chair, with the deliberate movements of a man who had learned to consider every word before speaking. "There are aspects of this situation that trouble me, such as the timing, for one. Mr. Caldwell has been making inquiries about your estate for months, long before Jeremiah Stone appeared at your door. He's also been purchasing debts from several of your smaller creditors, positioning himself to apply financial pressure if needed." The information struck Maebelle like a physical blow. "He's been planning this?" "It appears so. My suspicion is that he discovered Mr. Stone's identity through his own investigations and chose to reveal it at a moment that would cause maximum disruption to your emotional state and business position." Maebelle felt anger kindle in her chest, burning away some of the numbness that had paralyzed her for days. The idea that Caldwell had orchestrated this revelation as part of some larger scheme to acquire her property added a new dimension to her betrayal and rage. And Jeremiah's claim, how solid is it legally? Judge Hayes hesitated, a pause that told her more than she wanted to know. On paper, it's nearly unassailable. Birth records, military service, family documentation, all legitimate. But there are precedents for cases where inheritance rights have been complicated by long absence and presumed death. The question becomes one of intent and good faith, meaning that if Jeremiah Thornfield genuinely believed himself to be dead to his family, if he made no attempt to claim inheritance or interfere with the legitimate transfer of property to his brother's widow, then a case could be made that he waived his rights through abandonment. The legal technicalities provided cold comfort against the emotional devastation she felt, but they offered something she had been lacking for days: options. If she chose to fight, she might have grounds to stand on. "There's something else you should know," Judge Hayes continued, his expression growing more serious. "I've had visitors the past 2 days. Sam Rodriguez and Martha Flynn, among others from your household staff. They've been sharing their observations about Mr. Stone's character and behavior during his time here." Maebelle's stomach tightened with apprehension. "What kind of observations?" "The kind that suggest a man genuinely surprised by the revelation of his legal standing. According to Sam, Mr. Stone immediately began making arrangements to leave the territory when the news broke. He's been staying in a line cabin up in the mountains, but he sent word that he's preparing to move on before the winter weather makes travel impossible." The information hit her harder than she had expected. In her pain and anger, she had assumed Jeremiah would at least try to fight for what they had begun to build together. His apparent willingness to simply disappear suggested either profound guilt or the kind of integrity that made his original deception even more confusing. "There's more," the judge said gently. Martha shared some items she found when cleaning his quarters, personal effects that shed light on his story. He reached into his coat and withdrew a small object wrapped in cloth. When he unwrapped it, Maebelle saw a child's riding boot, small enough to fit in her palm, made of leather that had been carefully maintained despite obvious age. She found this hidden among his belongings, along with a locket containing photographs of a woman and young boy. The craftsmanship on the boot suggests it was made here in Colorado, probably in the early 1860s. Maebelle took the tiny boot with hands that trembled slightly. The leather was soft with age and handling, and she could see places where small fingers had touched it repeatedly, wearing smooth patches that spoke of desperate fondness. "His sons?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. It would appear so. Martha said she had never seen a man handle anything with such careful reverence. Whatever else might be true about Jeremiah Stone's identity, his grief for his lost family appears to be genuine. The small boot seemed to weigh more than its size warranted, heavy with the implications of a man who had carried this reminder of his greatest loss for more than 20 years. It spoke to a depth of pain that made his deception more understandable, if not more forgivable. "Judge, I need your honest assessment. If I choose to contest his claim, what are my chances? In a fair court, with all the evidence presented honestly? Perhaps 60% in your favor, based on the abandonment precedent and the length of time involved. But if Caldwell succeeds in making this about your judgment and competence rather than the legal technicalities—" He didn't need to finish the sentence. Maebelle understood the implications perfectly. A legal battle would expose every aspect of her relationship with Jeremiah to public scrutiny, providing ammunition for anyone who wanted to question her business acumen or personal choices. "There is another option," Judge Hayes said carefully. "One that might serve justice better than a court battle." "What option?" "A formal hearing conducted privately, where all parties can present their evidence and arguments. Mr. Stone would have the opportunity to state his position officially. You would have the chance to present your case, and the matter could be resolved without the spectacle of a public trial." The suggestion had merit, offering a way to resolve the legal questions without providing entertainment for gossips or ammunition for enemies. But it would also require facing Jeremiah again, hearing his explanations and justifications while her heart was still raw from the betrayal. "I'll consider it," she said finally, though she knew the decision was already made. She needed answers, needed to understand the truth behind the deception that had shattered her careful world. Judge Hayes rose to leave, but paused at the door with the expression of a man struggling with professional boundaries. "Maebelle, I've known you for 15 years. I've watched you build something remarkable from nothing but determination and intelligence. Whatever you decide about this situation, don't let anyone convince you that your judgment is fundamentally flawed. You've earned the right to trust your instincts." After he left, Maebelle sat alone in her study, turning the small riding boot over in her hands. Outside, the snow had finally stopped, and pale sunlight was beginning to break through the clouds. The light caught the leather of the boot, highlighting the worn places where grief had left its marks. For the first time in days, she allowed herself to remember not just the betrayal, but the man who had shown such gentleness with horses, such patience with a wolf that trusted no one else, such quiet strength in defending her honor at the social. Those memories sat uneasily alongside her anger, creating a complexity of emotion that defied easy resolution. The formal hearing would happen. She could see that now, as clearly as she could see the mountains through her study window. But before she faced Jeremiah across a table loaded with legal documents and official scrutiny, she needed to understand her own heart well enough to distinguish between love and the mere longing for companionship that had made her vulnerable to deception. The small boot caught the light again, and Maebelle found herself wondering what it would feel like to carry such a burden of loss for 20 years, to find unexpected happiness only to risk losing it again to the ghosts of a past that refused to stay buried. The formal hearing was set for dawn on the first clear day after the storm, to be held in the territorial courthouse in town. Maebelle rose before sunrise, dressing with the careful attention she reserved for her most important business negotiations. The emerald dress she chose had served her well in previous legal battles, its rich color lending authority to her words, while its elegant cut reminded observers that strength could wear many forms. Martha fussed over breakfast that neither of them could eat, her nervous energy filling the kitchen with the clatter of unnecessary preparations. "You're doing the right thing," she said for the third time, though her voice carried the uncertainty of someone trying to convince herself as much as her mistress. "Am I?" Maebelle asked, staring out the window at the pre-dawn darkness that still shrouded the mountains. "Sometimes I think the right thing would be to let him disappear back into those peaks and pretend none of this ever happened, and spend the rest of your life wondering what might have been if you'd had the courage to hear him out." The words stung because they carried truth. Maebelle had built her empire on calculated risks, on the willingness to face uncertainty rather than retreat into the false safety of inaction. But this decision felt different, more personal, more dangerous to the carefully constructed defenses that had protected her heart for decades. Sam appeared at the kitchen door, hat in hand and expression grave. "The buggy's ready, Miss Maebelle. Judge Hayes sent word that he'll meet us at the courthouse at 7 sharp. The ride to town passed in silence, broken only by the crunch of wheels on snow-packed road and the steady rhythm of hoofbeats. Maebelle found herself studying the familiar landscape with new eyes, seeing it as though for the first time, or perhaps the last. Every fence post, every stand of trees, every distant peak carried the weight of memory and the uncertainty of what tomorrow might bring. The courthouse stood solid and imposing against the morning sky, its brick walls and tall windows designed to inspire respect for the law's authority. Judge Hayes waited on the front steps, his formal robes lending gravity to the proceedings even before they began. "Mrs. Thornfield," he said, with the courteous nod due to her position. "Are you prepared for this?" "As prepared as one can be for having one's entire life examined and judged," she replied, accepting his offered arm as they climbed the steps together. The hearing room was smaller than a formal courtroom, designed for private proceedings that required less spectacle than public trials. A single table dominated the center of the space, with chairs arranged to suggest conversation rather than confrontation. But Maebelle could feel the weight of formality in every detail, from the territorial seal on the wall to the court reporter's station, where every word would be recorded for posterity. Caldwell arrived precisely on time, his portfolio bulging with documents and his expression carrying the satisfaction of a man who believed victory was assured. He nodded to Maebelle with perfunctory courtesy before taking his seat across the table, his eyes already calculating the division of assets he clearly considered inevitable. "Mrs. Thornfield," he said with oily politeness, "I hope you understand that this proceeding is merely a formality. The legal facts are quite clear, and I'm confident we can reach an amicable settlement that protects everyone's interests." "Are you?" Maebelle's voice carried the steel that had served her well in previous negotiations. "How fascinating that you're so certain of the outcome before we've even heard all the evidence." Before Caldwell could respond, the sound of approaching footsteps echoed through the hallway outside. Maebelle's heart caught in her throat as the door opened to admit Jeremiah, flanked by a man she didn't recognize, middle-aged, well-dressed, carrying himself with the bearing of someone accustomed to legal proceedings. Jeremiah looked as though the past week had aged him years. His clothes were clean but showed the wear of hard travel, and his face bore the gaunt look of a man who'd been eating poorly and sleeping less. But his eyes, when they met hers across the room, still held the same steady honesty that had first drawn her attention. "Jeremiah," Judge Hayes said formally, "thank you for coming." "And you are?" "David Morrison, attorney from Denver," the stranger replied, extending his hand with professional courtesy. "Mr. Stone retained my services to ensure his interests are properly represented in these proceedings." Caldwell's face showed the first flicker of concern. That hardly seems necessary for such a straightforward matter, doesn't it? Morrison's smile held no warmth. In my experience, when substantial property is at stake, it's wise to ensure all parties understand their rights and obligations under territorial law. Judge Hayes took his position at the head of the table, his expression stern with the authority of his office. This hearing is called to order. We are here to examine the competing claims regarding the Thornfield estate and to determine the legal standing of all parties involved. Mr. Caldwell, as the party who initiated these proceedings, you may present your evidence first. Caldwell rose with theatrical precision, spreading his documents across the table like a card sharp, revealing a winning hand. Your Honor, the facts in this case are straightforward and uncontestable. These documents prove conclusively that the man calling himself Jeremiah Stone is in fact Jeremiah Thornfield, younger brother of the late Thomas Thornfield and rightful heir to the family estate. He proceeded through his evidence with methodical thoroughness. Birth certificates, military records, family documentation that painted an undeniable picture of Jeremiah's identity and legal standing. Each document was authentic, each piece of evidence compelling in its implications for Maebelle's ownership of everything she had built. Furthermore, Caldwell continued, his voice gaining confidence with each revelation, Mr. Thornfield has been operating under false pretenses, deceiving Mrs. Thornfield about his identity, while positioning himself to claim what was never legally hers to possess. This represents not merely a question of inheritance law, but a clear case of fraud perpetrated against a vulnerable widow. The accusation of fraud hit the room like a thunderclap, transforming what had been a civil proceeding into something far more serious. Maebelle saw Jeremiah's face pale at the implication, while Morrison leaned forward with the alertness of a lawyer scenting legal blood. Those are serious allegations. Mr. Caldwell, Judge Hayes said carefully, do you have evidence to support claims of intentional fraud? I have the evidence of deception itself, Your Honor. Mr. Thornfield deliberately concealed his identity for months while ingratiating himself with Mrs. Thornfield and gaining her trust. The pattern suggests a calculated campaign to position himself advantageously before revealing his legal standing. Maebelle found herself studying Jeremiah's face as the accusations mounted, searching for signs of guilt or defiance that might confirm her worst fears. Instead, she saw something that struck her more forcefully than any legal argument, the quiet dignity of a man who was allowing himself to be destroyed rather than fighting back with weapons that might cause collateral damage to someone he cared about. The realization hit her with startling clarity. Whatever else might be true about Jeremiah's identity and intentions, he was facing these proceedings with the same selfless courage he had shown throughout their relationship. And for the first time since learning the truth about his identity, Maebelle began to wonder whether she had been so focused on the betrayal of deception that she had missed the deeper truth of his character. Morrison rose to respond to Caldwell's accusations with the measured precision of an attorney who had been preparing for exactly this moment. From his briefcase, he withdrew a folder that looked considerably thicker than anything Caldwell had presented, along with what appeared to be several official documents bearing government seals. Your Honor, Morrison began, his voice carrying the authority of someone presenting irrefutable facts. While Mr. Caldwell's documentation regarding my client's identity is accurate, his interpretation of the legal and moral implications is fundamentally flawed. He placed the first document on the table with deliberate ceremony. This is a sworn affidavit from Dr. Marcus Webb, formerly chief surgeon at Armory Square Hospital in Washington. D.C. Dr. Webb treated Captain Jeremiah Thornfield for severe head trauma sustained during the Battle of Cedar Creek in October 1864. Judge Hayes examined the document with the careful attention of someone accustomed to evaluating evidence. What does Dr. Webb's testimony establish? That Captain Thornfield suffered complete memory loss lasting approximately 8 months, during which time he was carried on hospital rolls as John Doe, unknown cavalry officer, When his memory began to return in June 1865, he discovered that his brother Thomas had been notified of his presumed death and had subsequently married. Morrison placed a second document alongside the first. This is Captain Thornfield's military discharge, dated July 15th, 1865. Note the annotation indicating his desire to be carried as deceased in all official records to avoid complications for his brother's new family. Caldwell's face showed the first signs of uncertainty as the implications of the new evidence became clear. That hardly excuses 25 years of deception. There was no deception, Mr. Caldwell, because there was no contact, Morrison interrupted smoothly. My client made a conscious decision to allow Jeremiah Thornfield to remain dead, taking the name Stone as a tribute to his fallen horse and disappearing into the Colorado mountains to avoid any possibility of disrupting his brother's happiness. Maebelle felt her heart skip as another piece of the puzzle fell into place. The pain she had seen in Jeremiah's eyes when he spoke of loss, the careful distance he maintained. From human connection, it all made sense if he had deliberately chosen exile to protect others from the complications his survival might cause. Morrison continued his methodical destruction of Caldwell's case. Furthermore, we have testimony from multiple witnesses regarding my client's behavior since arriving at Thornfield Estate. Not once did he inquire about ownership, inheritance, or legal standing. His focus was entirely on honest work and eventually on personal feelings that developed without any knowledge of legal complications. Judge Hayes turned to Jeremiah, his expression stern but not unkind. Mr. Thornfield, or Mr. Stone if you prefer, these documents support your attorney's claims, but I need to hear from you directly. When did you realize your identity might create legal complications for Mrs. Thornfield? Jeremiah stood slowly, his bearing carrying the weight of a man prepared to expose his deepest truths to public scrutiny. Your Honor, I first suspected Mrs. Thornfield might be my brother's widow about 2 weeks after arriving at the estate. She mentioned Thomas in passing, described him in a way that matched my memories. But by then, he paused, his eyes finding Maebelle's across the table. By then, I had feelings I hadn't experienced since losing my first family. I told myself I was being foolish, that the resemblance was coincidental. When I finally accepted the truth, I planned to leave immediately without explanation. What changed your mind? She asked me to stay, not as Jeremiah Thornfield with any legal claim, but as Jeremiah Stone, a man she thought she might be learning to care for. I convinced myself that if she never learned my true identity, no harm would come from a few more weeks of happiness neither of us expected to find. Caldwell seized on what he perceived as an admission of guilt. So you acknowledge deliberately concealing information that Mrs. Thornfield had a right to know? Yes, Jeremiah said simply, the admission cutting through the legal maneuvering like a blade. I was a coward who wanted to hold on to something beautiful for a little longer, even knowing it was built on incomplete truth. The stark honesty of his confession seemed to rob Caldwell of his momentum. Judge Hayes studied the documents spread across the table, his expression thoughtful as he weighed legal precedent against human complexity. Mrs. Thornfield, he said finally, you've been remarkably quiet during these proceedings. What is your position regarding Mr. Thornfield's legal standing and the accusations of fraud? Maebelle rose slowly, feeling the weight of 23 years of decisions and the implications of whatever she said next. Around the table, every person waited for words that would determine not just the fate of an estate, but the future of two people who had found unexpected love in the most complicated circumstances imaginable. Your Honor, she began, her voice carrying the strength that had built an empire and the wisdom that came from finally understanding the difference between betrayal and the kind of desperate hope that made even good people make imperfect choices. I believe it's time I told you what I've discovered about the original Thornfield family Bible and what it reveals about my late husband's true wishes regarding his brother's inheritance. The room fell silent as Maebelle prepared to reveal the final piece of evidence that would determine whether love could survive the complications of law, identity, and the ghosts of choices made in grief and desperation. Maebelle reached into her reticule and withdrew a leather-bound volume that had rested on Thomas's bedside table throughout their marriage. The Thornfield family Bible was old, its pages yellow with age and handling, its binding worn smooth by generations of hands that had turned to it in times of joy and sorrow. "This Bible has been in the Thornfield family for 3 generations," she said, placing it carefully on the table, where its presence seemed to change the very air in the room. Thomas read from it every Sunday, and in his final illness, he spent hours writing in the margins and blank pages. Judge Hayes leaned forward with interest. "What kind of writing?" "Letters, mostly. To his parents, to friends lost in the war, and especially to his brother Jeremiah, whom he refused to believe was truly dead." Maebelle opened the Bible to a page she had marked with a ribbon, her voice growing stronger as she prepared to share the truth that would change everything. "He wrote 47 letters to Jeremiah over the course of our marriage, documenting his hopes that his brother would one day return." Caldwell's face paled as the implications became clear. "Letters written to a dead man hardly constitute legal documentation." "They do when they explicitly address inheritance and estate planning," Morrison interrupted, his lawyer's instincts immediately grasping the significance of Maebelle's revelation. Maebelle turned to a page near the back of the Bible, where Thomas's careful handwriting filled the margins and continued onto blank pages. "Thomas wrote his final letter to Jeremiah 3 days before he died. Would you like me to read the relevant passage, Your Honor?" At Judge Hayes's nod, Maebelle began to read in a voice that carried across the silent room. "My dear brother, if you are reading this, then God has granted my greatest wish and brought you home to the family that never stopped loving you. I have left everything to Maebelle because she has proven herself worthy of the Thornfield name in ways that honor our father's memory. But I have always hoped that someday you would return to claim not just your inheritance, but your place in a family that has never been complete without you." The words seemed to echo in the sudden silence, carrying the weight of love that had transcended death and the complexities of law. Jeremiah's face showed a mixture of grief and wonder, as though he was hearing his brother's voice across 25 years of separation. Maebelle continued reading. "I have instructed Maebelle in my will that should you ever return, she is to share equally with you all that we have built together. Not because the law requires it, but because you are my brother, and this land needs both of your strengths to thrive. I pray that you will find in her the sister you never had, and that together you will build something even greater than what we began." Judge Hayes studied the handwriting carefully, comparing it to other documents that bore Thomas Thornfield's signature. "This appears authentic. Mrs. Thornfield, you're saying your husband explicitly provided for his brother's return and inheritance?" "More than that," Maebelle said, turning to the final page of Thomas's writings. "He made his wishes legally binding." She handed the judge a folded document that had been pressed between the Bible's pages. "This is a codicil to his will, properly witnessed and notarized, stating that should Jeremiah Thornfield ever return, the estate should be divided equally between his widow and his brother." Caldwell sputtered in outrage. "This is impossible!" "I researched every legal document." "You researched the official files," Maebelle said with quiet satisfaction. "You never thought to look in a family Bible for the personal wishes of a man who loved his brother, enough to hope for 25 years that he might come home." Morrison examined the codicil with the thoroughness of an experienced attorney. "Your Honor, this document appears to be legally binding under territorial law. It explicitly addresses the question of inheritance should Jeremiah Thornfield return from presumed death." The silence that followed was broken by Jeremiah's voice, rough with emotion. "Thomas really wrote this?" "Every word," Maebelle replied, finally allowing herself to look directly into those green eyes that had first captured her attention. "He never stopped believing you were alive, never stopped hoping you would come home. And he trusted me to honor his wishes, if that day ever came." Judge Hayes set down the codicil with the deliberate care of a man reaching a momentous decision. Based on the evidence presented, it appears that both parties have legitimate claims to the Thornfield estate, and that the deceased explicitly provided for this possibility. The question of fraud is rendered moot by Mrs. Thornfield's willingness to honor her late husband's wishes. Caldwell made one final desperate attempt to salvage his position. "Your Honor, surely the question of Mr. Thornfield's deception regarding his identity is a matter between him and Mrs. Thornfield," Judge Hayes said firmly. "This hearing was called to determine legal standing, not to adjudicate personal relationships. The law is clear. Both parties have valid claims, and the estate will be divided according to Thomas Thornfield's documented wishes." As the formal proceedings concluded and documents were signed establishing the new ownership structure, Maebelle found herself alone with Jeremiah in the now empty hearing room. The morning sun streamed through the tall windows, painting everything in shades of gold that spoke of new beginnings and second chances. "You could have kept it all," Jeremiah said quietly. "The codicil gave you the choice to honor Thomas's wishes or ignore them. No one would have blamed you for protecting what you built." "Yes, I could have," Maebelle agreed, moving closer to the man who was no longer a stranger hiding behind an assumed name, but her late husband's brother, returned at last to claim his place in a family that had never stopped hoping. "But Thomas trusted me to do what was right, not what was easy. And somewhere along the way, I realized that sharing a life with you matters more than owning an empire alone." When Jeremiah reached for her hand, Maebelle didn't pull away. The simple touch carried the promise of a future neither of them had dared imagine. Two people who had lost everything once and found the courage to risk their hearts again. 6 months later, as spring painted the Colorado mountains in shades of green and gold, Maebelle Thornfield became Maebelle Thornfield again in a simple ceremony that united not just two hearts, but two halves of a family that had been separated by war and reunited by love. The rings they exchanged were carved from Colorado gold, simple bands that spoke of mature affection built on understanding rather than passion, on shared purpose rather than mere attraction. Ghost attended the wedding with the dignity of a creature who had always known that some journeys end not where they began, but where they were always meant to arrive. And in the mountains that had sheltered a broken man until he was ready to live again, the wind carried the promise that some love is strong enough to survive any test, patient enough to wait for perfect timing, and wise enough to understand that the best chapters of life sometimes begin when you think the story is nearly over.